The situation in El Salvador with the gangs and U.S. involvement is something that keeps coming up. It feels like a really tangled web sometimes.
It really is very complex.
So for this deep dive, we've pulled together quite a range of sources, historical analyses, firsthand accounts, human rights reports, you name it. We're trying to give you, our listeners, a clearer picture of what's actually going on and maybe more importantly, why it matters, sort of cutting through the noise,
Absolutely. The goal is to trace the key pathways here. Our sources really dig into the origins and the nature of gangs in El Salvador. Crucially, how they're different from, say, traditional organized crime.
Okay.
And we'll definitely be looking at the pretty significant role U.S. policies have played, over the years.
Right. The policy aspect is huge.
Yeah. And the lived experiences of Salvadorans facing all this violence, the recent shifts in U.S. deportation practices, that controversial CE cot mega prison.
Oh, yeah, CE cot.
And also maybe touch on why it seems so hard sometimes to connect with these issues from, over here.
Okay, that sounds like a solid plan. Let's maybe unpack this by going right back. The emergence of gangs in El Salvador.
Right.
It seems logical to think the 1992 peace accords ending the Civil War would just lead to peace, right?
You'd think so.
But one of our sources makes a really interesting point. Those agreements were mainly political deals, getting the fighting to stop. Not necessarily about building a truly peaceful society from the ground up. Why is that difference important?
Well, because while stopping the fighting was obviously vital, the accords didn't really tackle the underlying social stuff, the economic vulnerabilities.
Oh, okay.
The things that can let other kinds of instability, like gangs, take root. And that's where understanding the difference between organized crime and gangs is so critical.
How so?
Organized crime, fundamentally it's about the money, purely financial. But gangs, especially early on, they often provide something else, a sense of identity, belonging.
Right, for young people.
Exactly. It's almost a cultural thing for adolescents looking for respect, for a place, when other doors seem closed.
So less about profit, more about status and belonging, at least initially.
In many cases, yeah. Though, obviously, criminal activity becomes central.
And a really disturbing part of that activity is extortion. One source called it an economic model where all of us lose. That sounds stark. How does everyone lose?
Well, think about it. Extortion doesn't actually create any wealth. It just moves money around.
Takes it, basically.
Right. Takes already scarce resources, often from the poorest people, and gives it to the gangs. It just cripples small businesses, creates this climate of fear.
So no investment, no growth.
Exactly. It makes everyone poorer, everyone less secure in the long run. It's like a parasite, really. It benefits very few, even within the gangs ultimately, while just wrecking the social fabric.
That makes sense. A really destructive cycle. Now let's talk about MS-13, Mora Salvatrucha. They're infamous. Our sources say they actually started not in El Salvador, but in Southern California.
That's right. Among Salvadoran migrants there. Many had fled the Civil War in the first place.
So what was going on in the U.S. that allowed these groups to form? And then what happened?
Well, that initial wave of Salvadoran migrants, back then, they often faced a lot of challenges: marginalization, discrimination, lack of opportunity.
Yeah.
And in that kind of environment, for some, these groups offered a sense of community, maybe even protection.
Yeah.
But the real turning point, the game changer, was U.S. policy.
Which policy?
The policy of deporting people with criminal records, including these emerging gang members, back to El Salvador.
And that's where the unintended consequences just explode, right?
Precisely.
The very people who fled the conflict were sent back. But now they're bringing this gang culture, this structure, into a country still reeling from war.
Exactly. A country completely unprepared, lacking the institutions, the resources to deal with this new kind of threat. It's almost like the U.S. inadvertently incubated the problem.
And then shipped it back home. Wow.
Yeah. And if you zoom out even further, historically, the U.S. role goes back even before that.
How?
Our sources remind us the U.S. pumped a lot of money into the Salvadoran Civil War itself.
Right, supporting the government side.
That support, whatever the political goals were at the time, it fueled the very violence and instability that caused people to flee in the first place.
So it's this long chain reaction, U.S. actions contributing to the conflict, which leads to migration.
Which leads to gang formation in the U.S., which then leads to deportation policy, sending the gangs back to El Salvador.
That's, yeah, a complex and maybe tragic loop.
It really is.
Okay, so then we see U.S. policy trying to respond later. Temporary Protected Status, TPS. That started in 1990. What exactly was TPS for?
So TPS is basically a temporary immigration status. It's granted to people from specific countries facing really bad conditions, armed conflict, natural disasters, that kind of thing. Stuff that makes it unsafe to return.
And Salvadorans got it because of the war aftermath and earthquakes, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Civil war, earthquakes, hurricanes. But then the Trump administration decided to end TPS for nearly 200,000 Salvadorans.
Wow, 200,000. What was the impact of that decision?
Huge uncertainty. Massive anxiety. I mean, these are people who'd lived and worked legally in the U.S. for decades, paid taxes, raised families.
Built lives here.
Totally. And suddenly they faced the prospect of being forced back to the very dangers many had originally fled.
And that decision was part of a wider push, right? Stricter immigration enforcement, more border security.
Yeah, that administration really focused on stemming migration. You had the zero-tolerance policy at the border, the family separations.
Which caused a huge outcry.
A massive outcry. And the attempts to end TPS were part of that broader picture.
Okay. And how did the next administration, the Biden administration, approach this?
A bit of a different tack. They proposed a big aid package, like $4 billion, aimed at tackling the root causes of migration in Central America.
Trying to fix the problems that make people leave.
That's the idea. Addressing poverty, violence, lack of opportunity there.
Well.
And they also extended TPS for some countries, including El Salvador, at least for a while, acknowledging the ongoing dangers.
So some shifts back and forth in policy. But despite those shifts, the situation in El Salvador sounds like it's still incredibly difficult.
Oh, absolutely. The sources paint a really grim picture. Just pervasive high levels of violence.
And it's mentioned that even having a tattoo can make you a target, even if it's not gang-related.
Yeah, it's incredibly dangerous. The assumption is often made, and it can be fatal. And we hear these just devastating stories of people deported from the U.S.
Ending up right back in the danger they fled.
Exactly. We have cases mentioned, like Walter T. and Gaspar T. They fled gang recruitment as teenagers, got deported, and then reportedly faced abuse from the police back home.
Horrible.
Or Angelina N. fled domestic abuse and gang harassment, gets deported, and allegedly faces more violence from the same person.
It's hard to even imagine.
And Mauricio de Jesus Amaya, also known as Santos Amaya, sought asylum because of gang threats to his family, got deported anyway. These aren't just statistics, you know.
No, they're real people, real lives shattered. Beyond these individual stories, what does the overall data show?
It's staggering. One source pointed out that the number of people reported missing in El Salvador since just 2010, it's actually higher than the estimated number disappeared during the entire 12-year civil war.
Higher than the Civil War.
Yeah.
That speaks volumes about the current crisis.
It really does. It points to this ongoing, deep crisis of violence and, frankly, impunity.
And it's not just the gangs causing the violence, is it? The sources mention issues with state security forces, too.
That's right. Very concerning reports. Accounts of police abuse, even alleged killings of deportees who seem to have no gang links at all.
Like who?
Cases like Carlos Alberto Garay and Mario Enrique Sandoval Gomez are mentioned. It suggests the problem isn't just the gangs. Sometimes the institutions meant to protect people are also part of the threat.
That's deeply worrying. And specific places get mentioned as being particularly bad.
Yeah, neighborhoods like El Junquillo, Apaneca, they come up in the sources as being especially notorious for violence.
And for people deported after living in the U.S. for a long time, they face extra risks, don't they?
They really do. They stand out. People like Yeshua O. and Baltazar G., mentioned in the reports, lived in the U.S. for years.
How do they stand out?
Their clothes might be different, the way they speak, maybe an accent. And there's often a perception, right or wrong, that they have money or access to money from relatives in the U.S.
Making them targets for extortion.
Immediate targets. And doing something that might seem normal in the U.S., like just refusing to pay an extortion demand.
Can get you killed in El Salvador.
Exactly. The consequences are just completely different and much more severe.
Okay, this brings us towards more recent events. These increased deportations and this controversial CECOT mega prison. The Trump administration apparently used something called the Alien Enemies Act to deport alleged Venezuelan gang members and some MS-13 folks to El Salvador.
Yeah, that's reported. The Alien Enemies Act is, well, it's old, really old, from 1798.
Wow. What was it for originally?
It was meant to allow the president to detain and deport nationals of a country the U.S. is at war with during wartime.
So using it now against people from countries we're not at war with, like Venezuela? That sounds legally questionable.
It raises huge red flags. Major legal and human rights concerns about due process, about whether there's actual evidence of gang ties or criminal activity for each person. Is it being used properly?
Yeah, seems like a stretch. And then there's CECOT, the mega prison. It gets a lot of headlines. Bukele's government hasn't shied away from harsh descriptions.
No, they haven't. Officials literally described it as a living execution chamber.
That's chilling. What do the sources say about conditions there?
Widespread allegations from human rights groups, arbitrary arrests just to fill the place, inhumane conditions, denial of basic rights, lack of due process.
Just rounding people up.
Concerns about that, yes. And the sheer size of it, the lack of transparency about who's inside and what's happening to them, it's deeply troubling.
And there was a specific incident mentioned, 238 Venezuelan migrants deported to CECOT in March 2025.
Yes. And what's really disturbing there is that leaked documents apparently suggest most of those Venezuelans had no clear criminal record.
So why were they sent there?
That's the question. And they've reportedly been held incommunicado ever since they arrived. No contact with families, no information from U.S. or Salvadoran authorities.
Incommunicado, that sounds like enforced disappearance territory.
That's exactly what human rights groups are alleging. Enforced disappearances. It's incredibly serious.
Have there been legal challenges to these deportations, the use of the Alien Enemies Act?
Yes, there have. Courts initially put some temporary holds on these deportations, citing concerns about due process, the risk of harm.
Okay, so some pushback.
Right. But ultimately, the Supreme Court allowed the deportations to resume. However, they did say these actions could still face judicial review.
Meaning the legal fight isn't necessarily over?
Exactly. The legality can still be challenged case by case or on broader grounds. It highlights the really significant legal questions hanging over these policies.
And mistakes happen too, right? Wasn't there a case of someone deported by mistake?
Yeah, tragically. Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia, a resident of Maryland, reportedly deported mistakenly to El Salvador. It just underscores the potential for terrible errors in this kind of rapid, high-volume deportation process.
Absolutely awful. It feels like weaving through all of this is this challenge of, well, getting people in the U.S. to care, to feel empathy. Why is it so hard to connect with this?
That's a really important point. Our sources touch on this. There seems to be sometimes a kind of psychological distance. We tend to categorize people maybe, see people in other countries or migrants as somehow fundamentally different.
The us versus them thing?
Yeah, maybe. It can make it hard to really grasp the level of fear, the desperation that makes someone leave everything behind.
Yeah.
And maybe there's also a lack of awareness about the history, about the U.S. role we talked about earlier.
How our own policies might have contributed.
Right. Which can make it harder to feel a sense of connection or responsibility. One source used the phrase mental block. It can be tough to see the shared humanity, someone risking their life on that journey or a kid facing gang recruitment.
Yeah.
They're just trying to survive.
It really does come back to recognizing that shared humanity. These are people, families, as one source put it, often just good people who love their children and their neighbors.
Yeah. So, wrapping up this deep dive, you really see how it's all connected, don't you?
Yeah.
The history of conflict, the U.S. policies and their often unintended consequences, the brutal reality on the ground in El Salvador with gangs and extortion, and then these recent very controversial deportations and detentions.
And seeing it all laid out like this, it just drives home the human cost. These aren't abstract issues or political footballs. They wreck lives.
They absolutely do. Which leads us to maybe a final thought for our listeners to chew on.
Yeah.
Given everything we've discussed, the history, the policy links, the consequences, what is the ethical responsibility of the United States here? Towards the people of El Salvador, towards those seeking refuge?
That's a heavy question.
It is. But we hope listeners will maybe look past the headlines a bit, think about the human stories behind the news, and maybe seek out a deeper understanding of what's still going on in the region.